Hey everyone, Charlie here. There is a weird passage that is relatively unexplained in Luke 22. This is right after the Last Supper or the Passover Jesus has with his disciples. It's right at the end of his ministry, towards the end of his life. And we're looking at Luke 22 today, starting in verse 35. This is, just so you understand, this is towards the end of the chapter, or I suppose middle of the chapter. He's already told Peter that he's going to deny him. He's already sort of sent Judas out to betray him. In fact, this whole week has been leading up to this moment, right, where, Jesus was even anointed with the woman with the costly perfume, and he said, she's anointing me for my death. So everything is pointing to the end of Jesus's ministry and life. And we know this because we've read the whole story. But there's this weird passage where Jesus says that we need to get some swords. And they say, hey, we've got 2 swords. Is that enough? And Jesus says, yeah, I think that'll do. But let's slow down a little bit, because this is a passage where you need to slow down and see sort of point A and point C. Bring swords, don't use swords. We know that he says that in the garden. And then there's a point B that we kind of miss what's going on. And when you catch what's going on here, I guarantee you it will probably change your prayer life like it has mine. So Jesus now is about to walk out the door to head to the Garden of Gethsemane. He says this to his disciples. He says, when I sent you out with no money bag, knapsack, or sandals, did you lack anything? Now, you go back to other parts in the Gospels, or Luke 10, if you wanted to see this in Luke, where he sent them out to heal the sick, cast out demons, preach the gospel. And he said, don't bring anything, it'll be provided for you. And it was. But in this instance, he's just kind of referencing that story. And he says, you remember when I did that? Did you lack anything? And they said, no, that went great. And he said, but now I tell you, right? But now let the one who has a money bag, knapsack, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. So this time he says, we're going to do this a little bit differently. And I'm going to get you ready for something else. Money bag, knapsack, and sell your cloak if you don't have a sword, and get a sword. Now, why would anybody who's following Jesus have a sword at this point? He's not been militant or political. He's not shown any violent overtures. But he says, you probably want to bring a sword. And he says, the reason for it, he says, I'm going to be numbered with the transgressors so that the scriptures can be fulfilled. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. And they say, again, there's 2 swords here. Is it? And he says, that's fine. 2 swords will be enough. Okay, so he says, bring your money, bring your backpack or sleeping bag or whatever. And then we need to get swords. And they said, we got a couple swords. And he says, okay, let's do that. Now, it's such a weird passage. This is not something probably typically preached around this time of year, Easter time, Jesus telling his disciples to armor up. We're going to skip through briefly the Garden of Gethsemane and go to the next section where these swords show up again, right? You ever wondered, why did Peter have a sword to attack the servant? Well, keep in mind, that wasn't necessarily Peter's fault. Jesus told him to bring the swords. So this part you probably know, you're probably pretty familiar with if you were, raised in church at all. Judas comes, he betrays Jesus with a kiss. Jesus says, you betray me with a kiss, that's pretty rotten. And then those who were around him saw what would follow. These are his disciples. And they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? There's the sword showing up again. Now, it's interesting. It seems like either Jesus doesn't answer or they don't give him enough time to answer. Not 100% clear from this passage. But obviously, if you know the story, they struck the servant of the high priest, cut off the guy's ear, poor guy. And then Jesus says, no more of this, touched his ear, and he healed him, right? So this is a story I think for a lot of people are pretty familiar with, right? And it says that one of the disciples, and we know from the other Gospels, it was Peter, typical Peter, took the sword out and attacked the folks who were coming after Jesus. And because we know this story and because we know how Jesus responded in a very typically Jesus way, don't do this, and he healed the guy, we sort of miss that in between there is this weird tension of, should we use the swords or not? I mean, they actually asked the question, should we strike these folks with the sword, right? So it's this very weird thing, and we have to go back to this in-between section now to understand what happened. Jesus said to bring swords. They brought swords. They even went to use the swords. And Jesus said, don't do that. And then it never comes up again, by the way. And I've heard before that this is an analogy or maybe a metaphor for Christians of, we should be capable of violence or should carry a sword, but not necessarily use it in the wrong instance. And I mean, I suppose you could get some kind of meaning there. But I want to highlight that in between these two accounts, bring the swords, don't use the swords, Jesus very specifically prayed this prayer: Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Now, Luke's account of this is pretty small. We know that he goes and he prays this prayer multiple times. The disciples fall asleep while he's praying the prayer, right? Because he's praying for so long, and he's praying so intensely that his sweat became like great drops of blood, which is intense. I mean, that's an intense metaphor there, because he was praying so earnestly, right? And he was in agony, right? He had to actually be strengthened by an angel because he was praying and pouring himself out so intensely. Now, I think when we read this, because we know the story and we know what happens, we get way too familiar and we miss something very powerful that happens between these three parts of the story. Jesus told his disciples to get swords, and here's the punchline: because he was going to pray that the Father was going to change the plan. And at the off chance that God was willing to change the plan, he wanted his disciples to be prepared to fight their way out of the garden, right? And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, Jesus says we're going to be numbered with the transgressors, bring swords, and then he goes and he prays that the Father would change the plan. Now, he already knows Judas has been sent off to do his dirty deed. He knows that the religious leaders are coming to get him. But he goes into this moment, and I think because we're so used to seeing Jesus as divine and him and the Father in this perfect alignment, we miss that in this moment, Jesus went to the Father and said, hey, I know we've been preparing for this thing, all my ministry, all my life, all this last week. I mean, maybe for all time. I mean, really, Genesis 3:15 seems to allude to the fact that, God had this plan from the beginning of the fall. The serpent would strike the heel of the son of Eve, but the son would crush the head of the serpent, right? And then all through the Old Testament, it seems like the cross and the suffering and the crucifixion is prophesied about, right? It's all throughout. And in this moment, though, Christ says, is it possible for us to change the plan? And he didn't just pray this prayer. And this is the only thing that we know that he prayed. And he prayed it for a long time, and he prayed it really intensely. This thing, which seems to be written in the very will of God, written in stone, Jesus went and he prayed, God, could we change the plan, right? Now, we do know in Philippians 2, Paul talks about how Christ, as an example of humility, became obedient to death, even death on the cross. What does that mean? What does that mean he became obedient? Well, it means it was something he didn't want to do, but he did it anyway. And in Hebrews 12, it talks about how Jesus Christ, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, but it also adds scorning its shame, right? The cross was a terrible experience for Christ. He knew what was coming. And in a moment, he asked the Father, could we change the plan? And I think part of us maybe just wants to remove the humanity of Christ too quickly sometimes and say, well, he knew what the Father was going to say. He was just really praying this part of the prayer, not my will, but yours be done. You don't do this for hours on end and pray with an intensity where you're sweating and dripping sweat like drops of blood if you don't want God to do something, right? If you're just trying to get your will aligned with the Father. And I think this is the thing that's really powerful for me, because it made me think very strongly about my prayer life and the way that I approach the Father, because I often approach the Father in prayer in a way that I would describe as not very enthusiastic, right? I mean, there are things I see in my life that I often feel are just sort of written in stone, and maybe even seem to be the will of God, that are things that are tough, that I don't necessarily want in my life. As of recently, because I've spent some time in this passage, and I'm not going to say that, it's 24 hours a day, but I've been praying with a real intensity as of recently, just believing that if I can pray with the faith of Christ, like he did here, maybe God will change something. Maybe God will change a very big something, or some things in my life. Maybe things that I never thought were possible to move. The mountains in my life could be moved. And I take real inspiration by this passage, right? Not just that Christ would pray this prayer and say, God, could we change the plan? And he seemed to really earnestly be asking that question. But he actually prepped his disciples and said, bring swords just in case I get this thing that I'm asking for. But then by the time we hit this passage later in the garden, And maybe even Jesus was waiting to the last possible minute to see if God would answer the question, right? Because there's this funny moment where they say, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? Jesus doesn't seem to answer, or at least there's enough of a pause that maybe he was just kind of one last time saying, do we strike with the sword? Do we fight our way out of here, God? And it seemed to be that by this point, Jesus has gotten the answer because he says, no, 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 we're not going to use the sword. I know I told you to bring swords. We're actually not going to use them. And it's after this, the disciples kind of go into hiding and they don't take the swords out again, by the way. So I share this because hopefully this is interesting to you, inspiring to you. If this makes you think about anything, I hope it makes you really think about your prayer life. What are the immovable objects? This is the will of God. What are the things that we've kind of put into this category of, I don't think it's good, or I don't think it's not what I want to happen, but God, this seems to be something that you won't move. And maybe you can attack that with the fervor of Christ and prayer, not necessarily with your own intensity of faith, but maybe just ask God if he would give you Christ's faith to say, Father, if you're willing, remove this situation, remove this cup, remove this thing from me, from my life, from my loved ones' lives that I don't think belongs, right? And if not, of course, God, I will submit to your will. But way before you get to that second part of the prayer, which is probably how I've been praying most of my life, is God, just deal with me so I'm okay with what happens. Why don't you pray that God would really change the circumstances like Jesus did here in Luke 22? Thanks so much.